It's been a little over a week since the United States experienced its most recent mass shooting, and it seems like the media has largely moved on. But do you know who has not moved on? This chick. I'm Corinne Straight. Are y'all ready for some straight talk?
Tomorrow marks 25 years since the deadly Columbine High School shooting in Littleton, Colorado.
America is reckoning with the violence that is tearing at the national fabric.
Well, chaos erupting overnight after 3 different mass shootings left 4 people dead and dozens injured across the country.
Minneapolis grieving tonight after a morning of horror.
Only a week ago, it was Atlanta. Before that, there was Milwaukee and El Paso, Dayton, Virginia Beach, Thousand Oaks, Pittsburgh, Santa Fe, Parkland, Las Vegas, Orlando, Newtown, Aurora, Charleston, Virginia Tech. The list of places and names goes on and on.
Fear not, dear listeners. After decades of mass shootings in the United States, we finally have a solution.
It's now widely understood that we don't need gun control. We need transgender control. We need to finally eliminate this demonic and anti-Christian ideology from the planet for good.
Y'all, how could we have been so blind? We've been talking about gun control when this entire time we should have been trying to implement trans control. I first came across this novel idea in a post from Indiana's Lieutenant Governor Micah Beckwith. And if you're not familiar with this guy, he says stuff like this.
If you look at the Republican ticket versus the Democrat ticket, it's strength and godly boldness versus I would say, the Jezebel spirit.
The Three-Fifths Compromise is not a pro-discrimination compromise. It was not a pro.
They have a right to see a judge.
Right.
They came here illegally.
But I was in prayer this morning, and you know what the Lord told me? He said, Micah, he said, I sent those riots to Washington. He said, what you saw yesterday was my hand at work.
Clearly, the dude is an idea machine, and he is pretty prolific on the internet. So if you want to learn more, there's plenty out there. Just be forewarned. It's maddening. Okay, back on track. Immediately following the horrific act of violence that targeted children in Minneapolis on Wednesday, August 27th, the right wing seized on this narrative that the perpetrator may have been a transgender individual, following a very predictable pattern of diverting any attention away from calls to regulate the weapon and putting all of their focus on the identity of the perpetrator and any supposed flaws they may be able to find in their character. Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted her support of a piece of anti-trans legislation, saying that it is likely this child was groomed and transitioned as a teenager. So I guess we're just speculating wildly here.
And speculate wildly.
Speaking of speculating wildly, when talking about another instance of violence committed by a trans person, Matt Walsh said this.
Jared Ravizza was, quote, a transgender person who identifies as a woman. Now, multiply this story by about 1,000, and you begin to get a sense for the massive blind spot that exists in this country concerning violence that's committed by the so-called transgender population.
Just arbitrarily multiplying things to make your point? No facts, no data. You just say, let's multiply it by 1,000? My goodness, Matt, is that all you got? Gun control proponents have years of research and oodles of data supporting their point of view that restricting access to the weapon actually reduces acts of violence. It reduces harm. If we're going to pivot away from gun control and go towards trans control, there has to be some data supporting that pivot. Doesn't somebody have some kind of numbers here?
We have to put this incident into the broader context of what we've witnessed in just the last few years. More than half a dozen attacks of a similar variety involving individuals who are confused about their gender, to put it mildly.
Okay, so there we go, Gorka. You gave us some numbers. They're vague numbers, but at least they're numbers. Over the last few years, there have been at least half a dozen incidents of violence committed by trans people. Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's say that the last few years is since the beginning of 2022, and more than a half dozen is 8. okay? One of the most frustrating things talking about numbers when it comes to mass shootings is there is no universal agreed upon definition for what constitutes a mass shooting. But according to Gun Violence Archives, which tracks all incidents of gun violence, they define a mass shooting as any incident where 4 or more people were killed or injured. Since the beginning of 2022, there have been 2,097 mass shootings. And although some of them involve more than one perpetrator, for simpler math, I'm going to say one perpetrator each. So 2,097 perpetrators. According to Gorka, 8 of those were transgender. But when we look at the transgender population in the United States, at most it is 1%. So 20 of those mass shooters out of the 2,097 would have needed to be trans to even be representative of the population. So it really doesn't seem like trans control is our answer here. Per the usual, the F Your Feelings crowd is all feelings and no facts. They seem to be obsessed with trans people, so they're just fear-mongering about them. And honestly, this kind of rhetoric is exactly why trans individuals experience violence at a higher rate than the rest of the population. But this is just the latest diversion tactic in the aftermath of this kind of tragedy. Do y'all remember the blame Marilyn Manson excuse after Columbine?
And in the Children at Risk segment tonight, we continue our reporting on the corrosive effects of the popular music world on some American children. Marilyn Manson has sold almost 5 million records since 1995.
Blaming music they don't understand is a classic go-to. Blaming video games is another one. They also like to blame the teaching of evolution in schools, the removal of prayer from public schools, general societal deterioration, or mental illness. Anything to divert attention away from the weapon. And nowadays, these diversions are being peddled by the MAGA crowd, largely the Christian nationalist crowd. A key tenet of this ideology is protecting the weapon above all else. Maintaining unfettered access to it will always be more important than human life to these people. But in their haste to blame everything but the weapon, they are overlooking a key piece of the puzzle. The Minneapolis assailant was born male, so for the vast majority of their life, they were treated as a boy, as a man, by one of the most important influences in the life of a young person, the internet. And although there is zero evidence that this person's gender identity had anything to do with the act they committed, there is a litany of evidence that they were radicalized online. They were taught to hate. They were taught to worship violence, like a man, a very familiar pattern among mass shooters. And when we look at the numbers, it's really clear that trans people are not overrepresented among mass shooters. They're actually underrepresented. But do you know who is overrepresented? Who only makes up about half of the population, yet commits over 94% of mass shootings? Men. Obviously, trans control is not the answer. And if we're super committed to not exploring gun control ever, maybe it's time we look at men control. Oh crap, Matt Walsh said this in a sepia tone, so it was way more dramatic. Let me try this again.
Trans control does not seem to be the answer. Trans control.
Trans control. Trans control.
Trans control does not seem to be the answer here, and the United States also seems to be dedicated to never exploring gun control, so it's time we explore men control. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Corinne Straight. I'll see y'all next time.